Welcome to Successful Parenting, where we, Jackie Rue and Robin Choquette, share practical skills for families to build resilience and healthy connections. As practicing professionals and parents ourselves, we hope this podcast is a resource for parents to grow, reflect, and learn more about themselves and their children. Our approach is simple, tangible, and most importantly, we lead with compassion for the integrity of the families we serve. This podcast should not be taken as medical advice and is intended for informational purposes only. We love our work, and we can't wait to watch families gain confidence and open themselves up to new ways of successful parenting. Good morning, Jackie.
Good morning.
How are things going for you?
It's a beautiful time of year. It is April. I can't believe it's already almost May, and talking about school ending and what to do for the summer, and we're already starting to plan for next year. So it's kind of an interesting time as we're heading into a pretty big transition.
Yes, and that summertime can be such a huge transition for families, figuring out, I'm sure for most families that have the smaller kids, they've already kind of figured out what camps they're doing and getting that all organized. And I think it is trying to balance between having fun and then also having structure in it. And we've talked about this before, but I think every kid's different. You know, some kids do great in the summer and some kids really struggle. And it's really, what does that child need? You almost have to work backwards, what the kid needs, and then plan from that versus, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then the kids fit into it, because that doesn't always seem to work.
Yeah. So we've talked recently, and truly, I think for parents, especially parents that have more than one child, figuring out what each child might benefit from or needs. We've talked a lot about recently that every child has different or unique needs. And, for some kids, definitely more downtime, but other kids really benefit from having a lot of structure. And so what we notice is even those children that feel like maybe they're really burnt out and getting ready for summer, for many children, just having some structure and routine, while it doesn't have to be complex, can really be helpful overall. While some children tend to do better with being more busy, and others, really having more downtime in the routine.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting. You mentioned having, multiple children. When you have that, I think it can be hard in parenting of how do we navigate this in supporting each child in this very unique way, because each child is very unique. And how do we support each child? I think managing that within the family system can be difficult.
For sure. And I was just talking to a mom, when I reflect back, 2 children a year apart, and I really recognize that even with planning their classes, I noticed that each one of them kind of took a different approach, especially as we got towards high school, where one of my girls really did better, being busy and thrived in a quicker paced schedule. And the other one definitely needed more downtime. And so it was important for me as a mom to recognize that both girls, although they were pretty similar in some of their skills and even intellectual abilities, they really thrived and did well in different pace settings, as well as in different levels of difficulty and stress. And I noticed that I really had to be aware of that, so I wasn't having the same expectations of both girls.
Right. And that is so I think helpful for the child to feel as though they're this individual. And I think most parents will say that they really want the child to understand that they are an individual. But so often I think we parent in a group setting because it is easier to do. And understanding, I think that uniqueness is so important. What is going on for my child and what do they need? We all do things trying to get our needs met, and trying to understand that, I think, is so important. And we talk a lot about that in our model. Listeners, if you don't know, we have written a workbook, and in there, we do have a lot of worksheets for parents to look at what is going on for themselves and then also for the child, and trying to understand what is the need that the child may have and how do we meet that?
Yes. And I think as parents, we often talk about we've made many mistakes ourselves. And so one thing some children or even teenagers will say to me is, my parents say to me, well, my sister did this, why can't I? Or they compare me to a sibling. And, one of the worksheets in our book talks about how we view our children and being mindful of not comparing our children to other children or even our children within our home. Obviously, we want to have some basic expectations that all of our children are going to be expected to meet. within our plans, differentiating how we're understanding and viewing our children, and sometimes even how we're viewing growth and progress and what we're praising progress and growth for each child, as opposed to grades or the outcome, as we've talked about before and as we talk about in our workbook exercises.
Yes. And I am finding, and know I've said this before, younger couples are doing more of these weekly or bi-weekly check-ins with each other. They talk about how helpful it is. And I think if we can incorporate that in families, I know we talk a lot about that, Jackie, and doing those weekly check-ins or bi-weekly check-ins. And part of that is praising and looking at the progress that's happening and the growth that's happening. And maybe you haven't reached your outcome goal, what you're wanting to have happen yet, but the child is still in development. And being able to recognize that, it also would really help the child to feel like, hey, I am moving along. I am getting this, although it may not look like that at some times. And I think that's so important to do in our parenting. And it's not always easy to find that time.
Oh, for sure. And I know when I'm talking to parents about their children or they're asking me advice, I always try to be cautious and kind of learn more about the child's strengths and weaknesses and even the child's perspective before, really giving too much advice, getting an understanding a little bit of the child. You and I talk a lot about even understanding language development, right? Is the child more a visual learner? I had a mom tell me recently her son has some sensory things going on and doesn't do well with a lot of talking and yelling. And she said, I don't understand because the child talks very fast and yells. And I said, well, it can be different when the child maybe is feeling a little bit more emotional. And then all of a sudden there's a lot of like verbal input coming in. And so just understanding that child, that for some children, we really don't want to do a lot of talking at all, but they do well with like simple reminders or visuals, especially when we're talking about praise.
What you said there, Jackie, about giving advice, I think that is something I have learned so much about being in the grandparent role of I'm careful of giving my children advice on parenting and advice on the child because the way I perceive it may be based on what I thought about, as a parent and not always what the family needs. And I think because each child is so unique and so different is really understanding your experience is totally different than another person's experience. Even within a family, siblings will have children that are different. Neighbors have children that are different. And I think that's so important, right, to recognize. And when you're giving that advice, be careful in how you give it. Here's the question. Can you be supportive without always giving advice? And I think you can.
Right. And sometimes just normalizing that all children struggle and all children have highs and lows. And I think that that's one thing that sometimes we forget. Parenting isn't about raising kids that are always comfortable and happy and are not struggling, but it really is about starting to understand our children. And when we notice behaviors that we're concerned about, kind of trying to understand what's going on with those behaviors. And maybe the child is not meeting a certain kind of mold or an idea of what we think the child should be like. But it truly is, I think, especially now compared to even 30 years ago, 20 years ago, it's a different life. Our kids are dealing with different things with technology and all the other things. And so kids look different. 18-year-olds don't necessarily always look like they're ready to run out of the house and launch, and parents get very concerned. But again, it depends on where the child is. So trying to understand versus label the child, I think is really helpful.
That is so true of labeling the child. And I think we do that. We have a tendency because we categorize and organize in our brain that way. I think it's very natural. And this is something we've said, Jackie, if I see a child as anxious, I'm going to treat that child as though they're anxious. Right. And they may not be anxious in the moment. And I think that is so important in being able to understand the child is different and each day may be different for them. Each hour is different, right? Things change. And then as we talk about each child is different and being able to differentiate between that, I think is so important. And then let's add in the need to be consistent. Parenting is it's not an easy task, but it is so rewarding.
Yes. And I think sometimes just not sweating the small stuff, as they say. And, we talk a lot about that in our model is sometimes envisioning, maybe a couple goals you have for your kids and focusing more on your responses than child's. And I think as parents, when we focus more on how we respond to the child versus how the child is maybe, we'll say like acting out or not doing what we want them to do, or maybe even doing really well, whatever the case, but focusing more on how we're going to respond and be there versus the child's behavior. And I know so much of our parenting book is really about parents looking at what they can control. And as they shift their responses and they shift their intentions and their goals, we know that it changes the dynamics in the family, but it also shifts the child's responses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's such a learning process, and there's no perfect parent, and there's no child that does well all the time. And if you feel like, gosh, my child, I'm really worried about how they're doing or how they're going to do, it's really about figuring out how to come alongside them versus getting upset that they're not where maybe the child next door seems to be.
Yeah. And feel like you're always pushing or pulling that child along. How do we stand next to someone and support them? Once we start to think of it in that way, to me, that always made it easier versus when I felt like I had to push them along or pull them. And there are times, that every child, you feel like you have to do that. And I think it's so helpful to kind of step back and go, okay, this is probably not what's really needed right now. A great conversation. I really like it.
Yes. And I know we have some follow-up conversations to this as well. And so if you're a parent listening, keep in mind that as parents, we've all felt like, oh, I don't know what to do with this child, or, I want to make sure that, I'm doing parenting right. I heard that quote this week. It really is about us all learning together and trying to lean in on each other and support our children. It truly does take a village.
Yes, it does. And listeners, we are for Mother's Day and Father's Day, we're wanting to get some quotes from you. What do you love about parenting? Send those in to us. You can just give us your first name, and you can give from the state or the area you're located and what you love about parenting. You can certainly send that to successfulparentingplan@gmail.com. We would love to get those. Well, Jackie, I think this is a wrap up.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us, and make sure to subscribe and like us to catch our next episode, where we will take you on a journey to find new ways of successful parenting.